So again, like to welcome everyone for joining us. My name is Monique Mitchell. We are going to be working in a chat forum tonight to ask Raymond questions, and we're going to get started momentarily. And how we're going to work this out tonight is Raymond's going to start with talking about on suicide and share his thoughts. And then he's going to open it up to the audience to ask any questions and have the conversation. If you have questions as Raymond is talking, please feel free to use the chat feature and we'll make sure that we do our best to get to all the questions that arise this evening. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce Raymond. I know most of you who are on here know Raymond. That's why you've joined us this evening. But I wouldn't be doing my due diligence if I didn't say that, Dr. Moody is a world-renowned scholar, lecturer, and researcher. And he's widely recognized as the leading authority on near-death experiences, as he did coin the term NDE. He is the best-selling author of many books, including Life After Life, Glimpses of Eternity, The Light Beyond, and Coming Back. Dr. Moody's work profoundly illuminates our understanding of death, dying, and grief, and offers compelling answers to the question, is there an afterlife? So tonight he's focusing on what questions associated with suicide and the afterlife. So thank you very much, Dr. Moody, and I'm going to hand it on over to you.
Well, first of all, thank you all so much for coming, and I apologize deeply about the problems a couple of weeks back. And I have tonight with me my wonderful friend, Doug Paris, who's in the background there. And he is an expert on computers, so he's going to be helping us. And besides that, he's just a wonderful man. So thank you all so much for coming. I see some old friends there. I don't see Gary Sayre, but I know he's here. I see his name, and some old friends that I've known for a long time. So thank you for coming. And I am a psychiatrist. As you know, I was mostly a forensic psychiatrist working in a unit for the criminally insane. But of course, all psychiatrists have a lot of patients who, it's a common thing in the emergency room when you're on call to deal with people who've made suicide attempts and so on. And so I have studied suicide as a psychiatrist, and yet at the same time, the way I think of it is more in my role as a philosophy professor. I got a PhD in philosophy before I went to medical school, and that's when I first started thinking about this issue, because Plato, who is my favorite philosopher, wrote a very revealing piece about suicide, which is called, if you want to look it up, it's called the Crito, his dialogue, this Crito, C-R-I-T-O, where he lays out some moral arguments against suicide and so on, and the philosophical arguments. And so I was greatly influenced in my thinking about suicide more by my career in psychiatry, in philosophy, than my career in psychiatry. And, a lot of the information you have in psychiatry about suicide is all very revealing and, of course, fascinating. It's there's all kinds of statistics about how common it is and so on. And those are interesting reading. Trouble is that those change from year to year, and they certainly more applicable to some societies than others. And so I'd like to talk more tonight, rather than the biochemical or those kind of things. I would like to talk about the human side of this. And I base that on several things. Of course, all the people I've met in the course of my psychiatry career who had attempted suicide. And also based on my own attempt. back some years ago, uh, I had, without knowing it, I had a condition called myxedema, which is profound hypothyroidism, and this sneaks up on you. And a very common way that myxedema is first detected is that somebody has a suicide attempt, and that's when the myxedema um, uh, comes, because when the myxedema is diagnosed. So that was my story. And it's so interesting. When I look back to the occasioning event, I don't even know what I was in my mind. I remember thinking that, oh, these problems I'm in are just overwhelming. There's no way to solve. But the wild thing is that now I don't even remember what the problems were. And I've heard that from a lot of people looking back on their suicide attempts, saying that the 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 part about the motivation is very obscure, that they remember making the attempt, but what occasioned it is very hard for them to put together. Um, Another difficulty is, of course, is what is suicide in the first place, folks? I mean, um, of the people I know in my life who are an adults that I know well enough to make this judgment, every one of them is committing suicide. I'm doing it by cholesterol. My wife, sadly, is doing it by playing with her cell phone as she drives down the highway. I have friends who are drinking themselves to death or smoking themselves to death or not exercise, all of those things. And what I'm getting at here is that looking at this in the cosmic picture, a lot of people worry about, oh, God is going to be angry at me or send me to hell or whatever. I don't think so. I mean, God working on a time scale of billions of years, I don't think that God is going to make the judgment, oh, you took 30 minutes by pills, you go to hell, or you took 30 years with cigarettes, you get a pass. I just don't think. And what I'm getting at is that a lot of thinking about suicide, I think, is kind of unrealistic in that it doesn't look at the bigger picture, in which you would call self-destructive behavior, right? Which gets us, almost all of us, in. And so then another thing that has led to my own personal response to it is I had an uncle who committed suicide in 1960 something when I was a teenager. And I will say, when I go back to that event, and feeling that I'm sure many other people know, is that I just wonder, is there something I could have done? I still hold on to that. What was that all about? And uh, may, maybe I should have gone to visit him. All these things, which I'm saying not to be autobiographical, but to say that I know what everybody is feeling. What I've seen more with my patients and so on who have lost relatives to suicide is that feeling that torturing oneself out, maybe there's something I could have done. I can see in other people's cases, not mine, I'm special, but when I hear that same thing that I talk about my uncle, when I hear about that from patients, what I realize is I think that the mind would rather believe that maybe there was something that I could have done, rather than to accept the reality of the situation, which is, in reality, there's nothing we could have done. I mean, I can see that intellectually in the case of my uncle. And I see it, of course, in all the people I talk with who've lost their loved ones, that, it's just a defense mechanism. The horror is that, as we know, that if somebody's intent on suicide, there's nothing much you can do. And I'm not just, recommending passivity. I mean, obviously, if you any sort of indication from someone that's there might consider suicide is an alert that you should take seriously, and encourage them the best you can to get to help or to call a doctor or something. And yet with all of that, it's pointless to lambaste oneself about what I could have done or couldn't have done, because the reality is that, if people are intent on it, there's nothing you can do. Then another factor is that a lot of things that are counted on the coroner's report as suicide, they were, in the sense that the person killed themselves. But looking at it another way, I mean, a suicide gesture can easily be converted into an actual suicide because of the circumstances. I mean, maybe they didn't really think that that many pills would kill them. It was just a gesture. And yet the attempt succeeded anyway, because the miscalculation was made. So it's just a very, very difficult thing to say. And I have friends I've known over the years from Japan who have an entirely different perspective than we do in the United States about suicide. That there, I mean, the social structures are not the same as they are in the United States. So this is such a complex issue that it's really boils down to the individual case. And there are general principles. I've been to suicide courses where most of the material was on statistics and so on like that. And well, the statistics change every year. And right now, as many of us know, there's a surge apparently because of the COVID and the depression and the stress that people are going through. And so what that means is that it's a good thing to watch and be careful and always listen. I mean, having wonderful kids myself, I just, I always worry about young people and, what they can be going through without us, rest of us knowing. I think that I am not religious per se. I do talk to God all the time, and he's never said a word to me about religion, but I feel like I'm on board with God, but religion is a different thing. And I think that a lot of the religious talk about the horrors of suicide, that you're going to go to hell and so on, I think that that's just a defense mechanism. It's a kind of threat. It's a way that we have of trying to prevent people from doing it by imagining this scenario in which God is going to put us in hell if we commit suicide. I think that's human anxiety. My experience of what people say about God from their own near-death experiences is that the being that people meet in their life reviews and so on is infinitely loving and understanding. And personally, I just don't worry about God being down on us for attempting suicide. I think it's a much more complex thing than that. I will say this, that everybody that I have ever interviewed, and this is without exception, who had their near-death experiences as a result of a suicide attempt, say that they would never attempt it again. And the reason they give is not sort of any cosmic view about punishment or so on. It's what they say is that a lot of them say that they realized in that state that, number one, they immediately regretted it. It's just like, oh my, why did I do that? And secondly, that that they say it's kind of, well, a recurrent expression I've heard from dozens of people over the years is that it's kind of like walking out of the middle of the movie, that you immediately feel this kind of regret, like, oh my goodness, you that I wouldn't be able to see that play out or how that would have happened. And also the feeling that had it gone through to completion, they would have had to have seen the results that their action had on their loved ones left behind, and the feelings and so on that this had engendered in their loved ones. But that's going to be true. That's not just suicide, right? It's what people tell us is that when you go over to the other side, you see this holographic, instantaneous panorama of everything you've ever done in your life. And in that panorama, whatever you see yourself doing, then you are empathically identified with the person that you interacted with. So if you see yourself doing something unkind to someone else, then you feel the sad feelings you brought about. Or if you see yourself doing a loving action to someone else, you feel the good feelings you brought about. So mostly what I want to do here is to talk with you guys and see what your concerns are. And but bless you. But that's my my thoughts, some of my thoughts about suicide. And I think that it's just a much more complex issue than most of us imagine when we think about it. It's, just all kinds of psychological considerations and spiritual considerations come up. And so those are the generalities of what I have encountered in my own life concerning suicide. And so mostly what I want to do tonight is to hear from everyone and hear what you would like for me to talk about tonight.
Thanks so much, Raymond, and appreciate everyone again joining us tonight. So for those of you who showed up a little later, welcome. And just know that at the bottom on your toolbar, there's a little feature called chat, and we are welcoming any questions for Raymond via that platform, just to try and keep everyone's sanity, if there is anyone still sane out there. I don't think I'm one of them. Just so we're not unmuting and talking over one another. So Raymond, one of the first questions that came through was wondering if you could share a little bit about how your friends in Japan view suicide.
Yeah. I've had a number of conversations over the years with friends of mine and colleagues of mine from Japan. I remember one wonderful man who was a Buddhist monk, and he had studied philosophy a little bit. So we were talking about this, and he said that there's not the same kind of social stigma in Japan about suicide as we find in the United States. And he said there's an old tradition of, I guess, honor suicides. If you dishonored yourself or whatever, that there is an appreciation of the fact that the strictures against it are not the same in Japan, as he said. Now, that would involve a lot of understanding of Japanese culture that I don't have. My daughter is the Japan expert. She's been over there, and she loves Japan, and she understands the culture more than I do. But my psychiatric friends that I've known in Japan have specifically talked with me about that it's just a different cultural setup. That is not to say that the grieving process among those who are left behind is any different, right? I mean, it's still, the grief is the grief. And yet, although the social strictures are different in confirmation, that I'm sure the grieving process is the same.
Thank you, Raymond. And we also have, so we have a few things coming through, Raymond, so I'll just read them off to you as we can. So this is from Tom Lorton, and Tom says, your thoughts on free will, determinism, and compatibilism in all of this. From my experience, it appeared that as if I was acting off a script concerning my girlfriend's suicide.
That's a wonderful question. And the whole question of free will, as you know, that's one of the big philosophical mysteries of the Western world. And I don't know much about Oriental philosophy, but I wouldn't be surprised to find the same in Oriental cultures. But I'll just tell you the truth, to be quite frank, I am not particularly troubled about the free will problem. And I studied this, of course, in philosophy, but it's one of the necessary things in the curriculum. But I was pretty much satisfied with the opinion of thinkers like David Hume, 1711 to 1776, and other thinkers subsequently who have talked about a view called soft determinism. And what that means is, well, in reality, we don't know whether things are determined or not. That's the kind of working assumption. But, that aside, the soft determinist position is that there is no real conflict between the notion of free action and the notion of determinism. And one of the great exemplars of this point of view was my favorite philosopher of the 20th century, a guy named J.L. Austin at Oxford. And in his paper on this, Austin pointed out that there are certain words in English, like free is one of them, but real is another one, which from their grammatical form, they seem like that they're asserting some property of a thing. Like to say that something is red and to say that something is free or real has the same grammatical format. And that makes us think that we're inserting something positive of an action, some positive attribute, when we say that it's a free action or whatever. But what Austin and Hume and others have pointed out, that in reality, when you say that something is free, you're employing a concealed negative, right? There's this parallel situation with the word real, and let me just illustrate it with that. Let's say I come home at night and I see, in the darkness, I see what appears to me to be a soldier standing there in a camouflage outfit, okay? Now I ask myself, is that a real soldier over there? Well, you can go through a long list of what it might be. It could be just an optical illusion caused by the conformation of the bushes, maybe together with suggestibility, like seeing faces in clouds. Or it could be a cardboard cutout of somebody, of a soldier that somebody put there, or it could be a mannequin, or it could be a neighbor of mine who's just out there playing and dressing up like a soldier. So what I'm getting at is that to say that something is real or to say that it's free is not really to express a personal attribute of it, but rather it's a particular attribute of it, but rather to rule out other things that it might be. For example, was I free when I did such and such? Well, I wasn't free. I didn't do it freely if somebody was holding a gun to me and telling me to do it. And I wasn't doing it freely, at least we think, if I was psychotic and, having a psychotic episode. But if all of those things are exhausted and there aren't any of those factors that apply, then it was free, regardless of whether determinism occurs or not. So, when you really think of whether an action is free or not, you need to think of the things that the standard conditions are ruled out. If nobody was forcing you to do it with a gun, or nobody was, or you weren't psychotic, or somebody didn't push you to do it, then it was free. And that really the bigger question of determinism doesn't arise. And I think personally where I've come to it is it's this thing we're in, this amazing life. Your question boils down to what kind of thing is this world that we're in? And if I got to talking about what I've reached, in my opinion about it, you might well think I'm psychotic, but I think where I've come and talking with thousands of people with near-death experiences and my own life experiences and my own uh, hearing people with near-death experiences, my own personal reflections. I think this thing we're in is kind of theater. And I know that sounds crazy, but what I mean is I think that the essence of your life is your story, and that life is a narrative phenomenon. Whenever you come up with some new event in your life, if you monitor your consciousness, you're putting that each new event into your life story. And um, one of my favorite thinkers of the 20th century, Elie Wiesel, said, God made man because he loves stories. And I think that's right, that, and all the people I know with near-death experiences say they learn in their life review that God has been following every aspect of your life story. And so that's how I think of it, that, um, and I, so that's what I think.
Thank you, Raymond. And we have Ann B would like to know more specifically about why those who have near death experiences regret having attempted suicide.
Well, because, one thing people learn in their life reviews is that whatever you do in life, you will experience from the other point of view. That's just the way apparently it's set up. And so I bet you that everybody here has done things in your life that you wish you hadn't done to other people. I know I have. And so in this review, in which people say literally every single thing they've ever done is there in this panorama instantly. It all takes, it's no time, it's all there. But that in this life review, you feel the other side of what you've done to others. If you see yourself doing something mean to somebody, then in your life review, you are that person. You are in that person's consciousness in the review of the situation. Now, I think that what better education is there? If you think about it, you're not going to understand the nature of your own action unless you see it from the perspective of the people that you've interacted. So my own take, and I'm not religious, folks, but I do have a relationship with God. But the way I look at it, God is just a great educator. And it would make sense, for example, that if my suicide attempt had gone through to completion, and as I sit here now, I would want to be able to experience that from the point of view of those who my action affected. So it's not punishment. It's not, people don't think of it as judgment or punishment, but rather as education, kind of. And another thing is that, people say that, as I mentioned, I've heard a lot of people say that they immediately realized that they wouldn't have known how this life comes out unless they had, that if they had gone, if the suicide attempt had worked, they would have been left mystified about how events would have played out if they didn't intervene that. That said, there's no clear line. I mean, what about people who are terminal, for example, and who are suffering in pain, and is that suicide or not, to have what they call assisted suicide? Well, I think that's a very different situation from the situation of somebody who in a hostile act decides he's going to take revenge on others, which I've seen cases like that, by killing themselves with the idea that it's going to make other people suffer. Well, there's just so many different circumstances. It's kind of like that word cancer. We use that word as one word, but I think in medical school, I think it's over 100 different illnesses which are counted as cancer. And I think it's the same thing with suicide. It's like the term suicide means very little to me. I look at the specific circumstances and what was going on, and did the person really think that they were going to kill themselves? I mean, just so many things. Yeah.
Thanks, Raymond. And you somewhat touched on this, but the next inquiry is from Susan Vickery Mercer, and she's interested in knowing whether individuals who attempt suicide and have NDEs and then they survive, do their experiences differ from other people who experience NDEs, or are they pretty much the same?
Pretty much the same. When I wrote Life After Life, I'd only had one case, and that was different. The man did say it was a negative thing, but in the broader picture of things, now having interviewed hundreds of people, there is no real difference. I mean, there's the same qualities of leaving the body and going into a light and see the life review and so on. But the difference being, as I said, there's this immediate feeling of regret. And that from that perspective, which they're then in, outside of time and space as we know it, they just say, oh, too bad. That's I'm sorry that if this had gone through to completion, then I would have my relatives would have been left wondering. And so, but as I mentioned before, that's the same as with any other thing we do, that if we do something to others that's harmful, then whether it has to do with committing suicide or just some other thing, it's the same sequence of event unfurls, which is a kind of educational experience where you get to see what you did from the other people's perspectives. And to me, that's just, what better educational system can you think of than that?
Thank you, Raymond. We have a question from Gregory Evans. When people were jumping from the Twin Towers back in 2001, while it should not be identified as suicide, how would it be labeled? Because it wasn't a quote unquote intentional act prior to smoke or fire reaching them on the floors where they jumped from.
Well, I would imagine, you can't understand the motivation of the people, but I would think of that as an escape phenomenon, just trying to escape from the flames. You don't, it's something you wouldn't have a real rational control over. It's just like when the flames are coming this way, you tend to jump the other way. And so I would think that, but you can't get into the minds of those folks, and they were in a state of severe panic anyway, most of them. So I wouldn't call that suicide myself. I would think of that as panic behavior.
Thank you, Raymond. And NB mentions a person who attempts suicide is already suffering terribly. So
Mhm.
why would additional pain become a deterrent?
Well, it's a different thing. It's like when people, the people I've interviewed who attempted suicide and talked to them about the events and the trying to get away from the pain and so on. But then as soon as they were out of this framework of reality that we're in, the time-space continuum, then the whole perspective on it changes. And it's amazing to me how quickly, once somebody is out of their body, that their perspective changes. Where people very often talk, for example, about when they can see their own body there, that they immediately start detaching their interest from the body. It's they just want to move on to the next phase, which a lot of people are drawn to this light and so on, and they kind of lose interest in the body, and that happens very quickly. So there you go.
Thanks, Raymond. And Eve LP is wondering, is there a different view of suicide by children?
Well, I'm sure there is, but that I don't know much about. I was not a child psychiatrist, and I just don't have the experience to be able to say. I know that even very young children have, attempted or completed suicide, and I just have to plead ignorance on that because, in the the practice I had a little basic course on child psychiatry, but that's really a whole different arena. And it's just not something that I really feel competent to even guess about. Sorry about that. But I know that, I mean, I have interviewed parents who were the victims of that. And just, I know the horrors and the suffering they go through. And I can well imagine and empathize from how that might be for the parents. But about child suicide per se, I don't know much.
Thank you, Raymond. And apologize, Mary, if I don't get the pronunciation of your last name right, but there's Mary Manow, and she wants to know, isn't that the way and she puts in quotes, the movie turns out for some, meaning that suicide is the real end as planned for some?
I have thought about that too. It's an incomprehensible and unanswerable question to what degree our life story is laid out in advance. I really don't even have a good guess. But what you say there as a conjecture makes that, that's always been very plausible to me too. That the way I often put it, let's say, imagine that you were diagnosed with a terrible infection that required you to be isolated on a desert island all by yourself for, say, 10 years. And in the cargo plane they took you out there with, there was room enough there in the cargo hold for all the food and water and medicine you're going to need for 10 years. But there was also extra room so that you could take along a DVD player and, let's say, 10,000 DVDs. Now, what I've asked thousands of people over the years is, under that circumstance, would you choose all comedies? And 3 people I've asked that over these said, yeah, I would. Otherwise, people say, no, of course not. And when I say, well, would you also choose some tragedies? And they say, well, sure. And then I say, well, if you were all alone on that desert island, watching that tragedy, would you be crying? And of course you would, because that's the experience of a tragedy. Now, what I'm getting at is that if there is some framework of existence outside of this one we're in, from which we come in here, if I had to guess, I'd say, yeah, there is. So from that framework, I can easily imagine that I would choose all kinds of unpleasant lives to go through just for educational purposes, because from that other perspective of the other realm, you would know full well that you're going to get out of it, right? So I've chosen plenty of unpleasant experiences in my life, just because I knew that I would live through them and because it was something to learn about. And I think that same kind of thing might well happen on a more cosmic basis. But that also happens here in this world. My dear daughter, for example, I have taken her a number of times to the amusement park, and I've seen we get in the line there. I would never go on a roller coaster myself. I've been on one once, and that was enough. But Carol Ann loves the roller coaster, okay? And I watch these people lining up to get on the roller coaster, and yet they full well know that when they're upside down going at 90 miles an hour, they won't want to be there. But they go in with the expectation that I'm going to live through this, and that even though the middle part will be horrifying, that I'll be somehow a better person at the end of it. And my honest sense, and not trying to persuade anybody else, but that's what I've come up and sort of think that life is all about. And that the added complication is that when you come over here, you go through an event boundary, which is an event boundary is like when you're in your living room and you decide you want to get something in the kitchen, right? So you get up and you go through the kitchen door to get it, but as soon as you go through the kitchen door, you forgot what you came in there for, right? And that's what Plato said this life is like. That over there, he said, just before you come in here, you see all these different life patterns laid out kind of like on a flat surface, like, and you choose which one of these to do for some bigger purpose, right? But then as soon as you're over here, all of that is wiped out. And personally, again, without any intention or interest in persuading anybody else, that is what I have come to think of, that this thing is that we're in is like. That as I gather, you live through one story here, and then you go through some incomprehensible process, and then you're back on another storyline, is what I think.
Thank you, Raymond.
And I
And
may be wrong.
well, we'll find out someday. Gary Sayre would like to know, what about people whom essentially nobody cares about? Why would they regret their actions?
Well, that's hard to answer, Gary, because let me think. The great majority of people that I have interviewed as a psychiatrist or as a friend who've attempted suicide, that's what they thought anyway. That their whole point of view in going in there was that nobody cared about them. So, and then you have to ask, well, then to what degree is that true? I mean, we all know people that think that nobody cares about them, but even though we may care about them a lot, right? There's just a certain kind of attitude. But I can, I worked during the, I guess, 70s or early 80s. I took a great interest in the homeless community. And I found out that there were different kinds of homeless people. There were the ones who hung around the Greyhound station, and then there were the ones who stood around the barrel in a vacant lot with the fire in it, and then there were the ones that lived under the bridge, and just all kinds of different subcultures in it. And you might look at those people and say, well, nobody cares about them. In reality, once you get into that homeless community, they care about each other quite a bit, was what I noticed. So, that's a very hard judgment to make. I can understand how even when I was in my depression, I remember feeling that it would be better for other people that if I wasn't around. That was my honest conviction. But then as soon as you're out of that depression, you have a different perspective. Oh my God, what did I almost do? So but I understand that feeling of nobody cares about me and so on, but it's it's not reality.
And Raymond, Cindy Dorr would like to know if you could explain a psychotic break.
Yeah, well, I can and I can't. Being a psychiatrist, I could give you some definitions, but being a philosopher, it's a very strange concept. But basically, a psychotic breakdown, what the basic definition of it has to do with a inability to be in contact with reality, right? Now, what that assumes is we know what reality is, and I don't as a philosopher, but I understand also that a lot of medical doctors do think that that they know what reality is, so they can make this judgment. But symptomatically, the symptoms of a psychosis would be hallucinations, hearing things most often. Seeing things is not really people think that mentally ill people see things, and maybe sometimes they do, but by and large, the hallucinations in schizophrenia, for example, are auditory. It's like hearing things, and that if somebody is seeing things, the more likely diagnosis is what we call delirium, which comes from some sort of metabolic failure, for example. And so that's where people see things, or delusions. And what that means, a delusion is a fixed false belief that is immune to rational questioning. The person can't be persuaded out of the delusion by reasoning, and that is inconsistent with, they're calling me about I'm sure they're calling you too about your car warranty running out. They call me about 20 times a day to tell me that my car warranty is running out and I don't even have a car. So anyway, um, delusion is a false belief that is inconsistent with the person's culture. For example, if I suddenly started to tell my wife tonight with great conviction that Haile Selassie of Ethiopia is God and that I have to smoke 20 joints a day to honor this God, I mean, and I couldn't be talked out of that. My that I would be delusional. However, if I were transported a couple of hundred miles down to Jamaica and started talking that's the sort of theology of the Rastafarian religion. So these things are partly culturally based, which is creating right now a major difficulty in the conception of delusion. Because now that everybody can get on the internet, they can find other people with their very delusion. So then it's no longer see something that is against your cultural norm. So it's the whole process. I mean, the whole idea is changing. But those are the classical definitions: a loss of contact with reality, which involves hallucinations and delusions, or delusions, and or certain kinds of processes of thought, like dissociated thoughts, like inability to keep your thoughts together, loose associations, and those are the general things. But it's when you are a medical doctor, you have to think in these terms, because the point of making these evaluations in the emergency room for a psychiatric patient is not to figure out the reality of the world, but rather to figure out, what am I going to do to help this person? If you're a philosopher, you can come back and look a bigger way, that, well, really, what is reality, and how do we know what it is? What is knowledge anyway? So, but the clinical psychosis is a clinical term, and it can't really solve the big metaphysical questions about the nature of reality.
Thank you, Raymond. And just give everyone a touch point, we have about 10 minutes left in our time together. So if you do have any other pressing questions that you want to ask Raymond, please do put those in the chat. And if we're unable to get to those in the chat, I imagine Lisa and Raymond have a snazzy way of following up with folks. But this one here is from Shirley Weddle, Raymond, and Shirley says, from what I have read and studied, we are spiritual beings having an earthly experience, occupying temporary organic bodies for the purpose of loving one another and seeking knowledge. Yeah. I don't want my son, who died by suicide, to suffer in his life review.
Yes.
Is the life review more of an educational review that is part of adding knowledge and understanding, or is there pain involved?
Well, yes, people do experience pain, but it is within the context of, you're out of that framework anyway. So you regret the things that you have done, but the whole tenor of the experience is they say it's not an experience of judgment, that it's not any kind of punishment. People very much look at it as an educational experience. And what better educational experience could there be, really, than to empathically identify with how your actions have affected others? So I'm hoping to recuse myself from my own life review, but there is just really, of course, that's the point of it, is that you see it from the other person's perspective and you understand their pain. And also you understand your own pain much more. People say things like, I understand why I did that now, so I'm not so harsh as I was, and my guilt about it beforehand.
Thanks, Raymond. And I do want to let you know, Raymond, as we are moving through and you are providing responses, folks are certainly expressing their appreciation for your feedback and putting that in there. So I
Thank
just wanted you to know. Nancy has said, because I have thyroid disease,
you.
I've always wondered how low thyroid causes depression and sometimes suicidal thoughts. What is the mechanism for that? Something to
Well,
do with serotonin?
they say depressed, but I'll tell you the truth, Nancy, I bet you agree with me that if you've had depression and then you know that feeling from your low thyroid, I don't think that's exactly depression. To me, it's two different things. It's when I had my thyroid disease so badly without knowing it, it wasn't like depressions I've had subsequently. It was more like total loss of energy. Um, my TSH for Nancy was 119, and I had no measurable thyroxine. And this had been going on for undetected for 20 years. So, but as I recall it, it was just so hard to get through the day. I felt like the whole day I was like walking through granulated jello. I mean, the energy. So my experience has been that although it's easy to see why somebody would think of it as depression, it wasn't the same. The thyroid disease was just like totally in a fighting a world that just wouldn't yield to you. I mean, you just couldn't do anything except want to lie by the fire and go to sleep. Whereas depression has to do more with loss of self-esteem, I think, is the classical definition. But that's my take on it.
And Raymond, I'll just put a little joke here. Gregory Evans put a little smile on my face. Thank you, Greg. He says, Dr. Moody, I don't think that you can skip your own life review unless you had permission from your guides and counsel pre-birth. Laughing out loud. So
I agree with you. And of course, I was just making a joke. You guys should know I was a comedian for a while. But yeah, I agree with you. Absolutely. It's, you don't get out of it that easily.
And we have one last question in the chat, so hopefully we can get to that, Raymond, before we close in 5 minutes.
Yeah.
And this is from Gary Sayre. I hope I'm
Hi,
pronouncing it
Gary.
correctly.
Hi.
He would like to know, do people see their pets on the other side?
And Gary is an old dear friend of mine, and I don't see you, but it's so happy to hear from you, Gary. And yes, I have heard that a few times. People say that they see their pets. But Gary, my own suspicion, and don't believe this on the basis of what I say, it's just a kind of sense that I have that I think it might be more common than I hear. That maybe because I know, for example, in my grief practice, people are grieve about their pets, but they feel like others will think that they are weak or something by. So that's what I've heard of a lot of, and I just kind of feel like, although it's very uncommon, that I think that it might be more common because for some reason people feel that others will think they're weak or something. So, but I don't know, but that's my thought.
So, Raymond, Shirley had said, I so appreciate you sharing what you've learned and offering us this opportunity to ask questions. You make such a tremendous difference and comfort to us who have lost a loved one to suicide.
Oh, thank you.
And I just wanted to, we have 4 minutes, Raymond, and I do want to just ask you if you wouldn't mind. I imagine there's a number of folks here tonight who have had the experience of someone who's died from suicide in their lives or is connected to someone. And is there a few words you might want to share with those folks who are really suffering with these losses?
Well, I think that when you lose a child, for example, to suicide or anything else, there's certain griefs that just can't be resolved. I lost my first child at 36 hours. He was in 1970. That was what, 51 years ago. It's like the grief is the same. I've grown bigger around it, so it occupies a lesser percentage of my total being, but the grief itself is just the same. And I just, there's some things that that are just almost unhealable. I think that the loss of my son is something that won't be healed within this framework that we're in now. And where I've come in, incidentally, folks, I feel really guilty about what I'm saying now because I don't, I'm not commercial, and I just hate the idea of selling things. But I do want to say that I've just published a new book, which is available at Amazon, which is called God is Bigger Than the Bible. And what it is, it's reflections about God that I've come up with from the many people I've talked with from who've had near-death experiences, and also from my own personal encounters with God. And some of the things people are asking about are touched on in that book. So I put a lot of this down recently in that book. So, anybody who wants to take a look at that, I mean, again, I'm not trying to sell a book, but it's, I do the, I'm really proud of this book because it's something I've put this a long, many years of reflection in that, but some of these things are touched on. And so, and if anybody does read the book, I would just greatly appreciate any comments you have on it, because I'm just looking forward to hearing for how people respond to this.